Hello and welcome back to Talking Blarney. Japan is a bucket list destination for world travelers. Its unique blend of culture, food, and technological advancement make it one of the most unique places on Earth. Today's guest is historian and author Dr. Chris Harding. He's a Japan expert, and he will be sharing with us the philosophical underpinnings of Japanese culture, the historical significant moments that shaped the country, and how it became a technological and economic powerhouse. Enjoy. Dr. Chris Harding, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Have you heard of the phrase post-Japan depression?
Oh, I haven't heard it called that. Is that when you come back from visiting and everything back home looks sort of second rate? Is that something like that?
Exactly. There's threads of this on Reddit and social media. When Westerners visit Japan, they come back and they're always like a little depressed here. They think everything's dirty, transit doesn't work. Why do they kind of get that impression when they come back to their home countries after visiting Japan for a while?
I have that as well. It's even worse for us. My wife is from Japan, so I have to put up with her listing all the things that work better in Japan than here in the UK. I think it's sort of fair enough. I mean, I'm speaking only, from the UK, which I love, but yes, it sometimes feels dirtier. There's maybe a bit more crime. The cars aren't as new. Sometimes when I land in Japan, it looks like everyone's just driven a new car out of the showroom last week. It's extraordinary, freshly tarmacked streets, etc. I think that makes sense actually as a comparison when you get back. The only thing I suppose I'd say as someone who lived in Japan for a bit, and maybe we'll get into this later, all the lovely things that Japan has, there's another side to it, which is that people have to work very hard for that. They put up with a lot of pressure at school, at work. There's a sort of sacrifice of freedoms compared perhaps with what you and I may be familiar with. So yeah, the post-Japan depression is definitely very real, but the price paid in Japan for living that way, I think, is also quite real.
Yeah, there's no free lunch, right? There's a double side to everything. So
Absolutely, yeah.
Japan has become a travel destination. It's renowned for food, its culture, entertainment, products are shipped all over the globe. What is it about Japanese culture that makes it so unique when you look at it in the global stage of countries?
It's a great question. I think one way that people often answer it, and I know people in Japan would answer it this way as well, is that it has a really interesting blend of tradition and modernity. So if you land in Tokyo, of course you can see this ultra modern city, skyscrapers, neon, brilliant transport. People who are fans of manga and anime, they'll be used to that kind of futuristic side of Japanese culture. Then you jump on a Shinkansen, in its own way quite futuristic, even though it's 1960s tech, right? It still feels quite futuristic. You head over to Tokyo and you've got a city there which is more than 1,000 years old. These ancient temples, shrines, and there's some way in which Japan has, I think in the last 150 years, really tried to blend that tradition, that inheritance with the best of the modern world. So I think Japan seems to do that really well. I think the other thing that people really appreciate when I speak to people who've been there, as tourists and come home, is there's a sense of calm there. There's a sense of people looking out for each other. You don't feel that there's much aggression on the streets, that something unpleasant is going to go down. Famously, it's not quite crime free, but very nearly crime free, especially women friends of mine who want to go out late at night, going home by themselves. There's no particular worry about what might happen to them, on the way home. So those sorts of things about Japan, I think, really seem to appeal to people. We were just thinking about, the World Cup, which is coming up in the States shortly. Certainly here in the UK, whenever Japan plays a match, one of the things our cameramen and camerawomen look out for after the match finishes, they pan over into the stands, where the fans are, because you can always see the Japanese fans with these little bin liners putting all their trash into them and taking them away. And we're all saying, oh, isn't that great? Why can't we do that? Why can't we have that? That's the one phrase I hear from people when they get back from Japan.
Well, you're saying that history and tradition is obviously taken into account in their modern culture. Why don't we kind of start from there and just kind of talk about that cultural heritage, that tradition that was built up over time? We'll pull it all the way back here. When did people start arriving in the Japanese archipelago? And then how did it start differentiating itself from mainland Asia and becoming a distinct culture?
Yeah, so we're talking tens of thousands of years ago. There used to be land bridges or periodic land bridges, depending on the rising and falling of sea levels, land bridges between mainland Asia and Japan. So, the first people will have crossed over those land bridges, along with all sorts of fascinating animals like woolly mammoths, etc. And of course, on boats as well. The southern part of the Korean peninsula is very, very close to the island of Kyushu in Japan, the southern main island. So crossing over really for tens of thousands of years. And I suppose from what we know from archaeology and from the earliest writings, Japan was very, very heavily under the influence of Chinese culture from very early on, so from at least 2,000 years ago. So you see some Japanese, in fact, the first known person in Japanese history is a woman called Himiko, who was a chieftain, a very, very powerful chieftain. Some people thought she was a shaman, so that she communed with the gods to control her people and to fight off her enemies. But she had diplomatic relations with China. And so for centuries after that, in Japan, they get influence from Buddhism, from China via Korea, from Confucianism, a lot of Japanese food, although Japanese people won't always like you pointing it out. A lot of Japanese food is Chinese in inspiration. You've got rice agriculture coming in, tools, bronze, Chinese characters, Japanese language is based, the written language is based on Chinese, all sorts of elements of the law as well. Clothes, a lot of the early Japanese fashion is based on Chinese examples. So I think one of the big things of Japanese history is Japan importing ideas from elsewhere. Early on from China and Korea, later on from Europe, and then later on from the US and elsewhere, and sort of gradually domesticating them bit by bit. So, take it up, we'll stay in the past, obviously, for most of what we're going to be saying, but take it up to present day just briefly. What's the biggest sport in Japan? It's baseball. Thanks to the influence of the US in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So Japan's been really good at domesticating, adapting, making its own all these cultural imports. But I would say from the earliest time, probably until about 1600 or so, China is the source of so much of Japanese culture. It's a huge inspiration for Japan.
What about religious elements here? Because is it Shinto was the founding religion, and then Buddhist and Confucianism came in as well? How did all these religions interact? How did it kind of structure the cultural foundations for the country?
Yeah, as you say, so Shinto, which means the way of the gods, is, we sort of think about it as Japan's indigenous religion, its earliest religion. Wasn't called sort of Shinto right at the beginning, I suppose, but it was this sense that the gods, or the kami, are everywhere. So in a great mountain like Fuji, there'll be a god there. In a waterfall, in a forest. People who love Studio Ghibli anime, those films, will get a real sense, I think, of the natural world being alive with spirits. So I suppose that's the original kind of religious intuition in Japan. So then Buddhism comes in, obviously from India through China, through Korea, and into Japan, maybe around the 6th century CE. And some people in Japan at the time said, this is a bad idea. You've got these immigrant gods, as they would have thought of it, coming in, going to offend the local gods, the gods of what we would call Shinto now. And so just after Buddhism came in, now and again there would be these natural disasters, which Japan is quite prone to. But some people will say that's because the gods aren't happy. And so they take a Buddhist statue and they throw it into a river just to say, sorry about that, sorry about Buddhism. But over time, over the next few centuries, Shinto and Buddhism came together in the most extraordinary way. So probably for about 1,000 years, maybe a little bit more, until really the 19th century, a Shinto shrine and a Buddhist temple would share the same land. They'd be in exactly the same place. It's like a sort of a Christian church and a mosque sharing the same territory. In some ways that'd be a really interesting idea. But in Japan, it's completely natural. And they came up with this idea that Japan's gods are kind of manifestations or versions of Buddhist deities. So they're the same gods, but seen in different ways. So that allowed Buddhism and Shinto to get on really well. You have this real connection between them. I think to the point where for most of the last 1,000 years, if you'd asked someone in Japan what element of what you believe is Buddhism and which element is Shinto, the question wouldn't have made any sense to them. These things became, I think, really close. And it's interesting because when Christianity came into Japan briefly in the 16th century, for about sort of 90 or 100 years, European missionaries were out in Japan from Spain and Portugal. Christianity was really popular. Hundreds of thousands of people became Christians, but it struggled because to be a Christian, you had to consciously reject these other gods. There was no question of continuing to worship Shinto gods, Buddhist deities, and be a Christian. You had to choose. And some in Japan found that a really alien idea because they're so used to the idea that actually you draw what you can from different religious traditions. Someone described it to me really well. They said it's kind of like spiritual double glazing, in a kind of dangerous, unpredictable world. It's good to have as many deities on your side as you possibly can. I think that's fair to say that's maybe a Japanese way of thinking about it.
That's really interesting. They're taking kind of the best of all pieces of the religion. They're taking the best from China and the food, and they're kind of making it their own, kind of refining it out on the islands there. When does that kind of distinct break from China occur? And how did kind of the Japanese, I don't know, culture, for lack of better words, kind of congeal and kind of become what it is?
Yeah, it's a great question. People sort of argue about it quite a bit. I'd say, or I think a lot of people would say, if you want to put a rough date on it, and it's obviously tricky to do, but around the year 1000, you have what some people call the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji by a woman called Murasaki Shikibu. A lot of people say if you read that novel and you get a sense of how people dressed, how they spoke, how they wrote poetry, what romance and love meant to them, what they considered to be sophisticated and good, everything in that novel really reflects a kind of refined Japanese sensibility, whether it's religion or romance or art, whatever it is. You could still see in that influences from China, right? Japanese poetry influenced by Chinese poetry, Japanese kimono has its Chinese influences, etc. But by this point, there's a noticeable Japaneseness to the culture. I think that's what people would say. Sometimes the way they would describe it, I mean, I've given you all sorts of different dimensions of it, but one thing the Japanese have sometimes said to try and distinguish themselves from China is that Japan is more emotional and more intuitive. Some people see that as a bit of a cliche and not really very fair, but this is how a lot of Japanese have thought of it, that there's a kind of deep feeling in Japanese poetry that connects you to nature. And in particular, it connects you to the idea that nature is always passing away. So I suppose lots of your viewers know about cherry blossom season, right? In the spring in Japan. One of the reasons it's been so huge for centuries is it shows you that at its peak of beauty, when the blossoms are out, that beauty is already passing away. The cherry blossoms bloom for a few days, then they're on the ground, then they're rotting away, and that's it, it's all done. So that sort of Japanese intuition of beauty, part of being beautiful is the sense that it's already passing away. You can't hold on to it. It's always moving. I think they would say that particular sensibility is quite Japanese. So there's a moment in The Tale of Genji. It's a huge book, but it is a lovely book if people have got time to read it, where the protagonist is mourning the death of one of his lovers, and he's writing this extraordinary poetry, and you realize that his love for this woman is at its greatest just when she's gone, because that's when he realizes quite how much she meant. Again, that sense of things passing away, and the idea that in Japanese poetry, art, etc., that's the kind of central emotion. I think a lot of people would say that is a Japanese kind of culture.
They're making this emotional, cultural, artistic separation here. Now, in terms of the political separation, I want to key in on a Prince Shotoku's letter to the Chinese emperor. I don't know how this didn't backfire. You know, can you kind of tell that story about that letter he sent to the Chinese emperor?
Yes. So I suppose the kind of little bit of background here is that the Chinese used to refer to the Japanese as the wo in Chinese, or wa in Japanese, which is dwarf people. That's one reading of it. People who are sort of short in stature, and obviously the Japanese, you don't want to call your country after being the short people. And so there was a point in time, no one really knows exactly when, but certainly by the 8th century, we do know that Japan was referring to itself as the land of the rising sun, Nihon. So if you think about the map, think about where China is, and think about Japan to its east. From the point of view of China, Japan is the land of the rising sun. Funnily enough, from Japan, the US is the land of the rising sun, right? Although quite a long distance across the Pacific. So they started calling themselves that. And Prince Shotoku, who you mentioned there, sort of semi-legendary figure, wrote or helped to write this letter to the Chinese emperor, basically implying or seeming to imply two things, which kind of, as you hinted, would really upset the Chinese emperor. One is that the emperor of Japan was placing himself or herself at this time on the same level as the emperor of China, which in the kind of the East Asian system, you absolutely don't do. They in China, the sense of who the emperor is a person whose job it is to keep peace on earth. China is the Middle Kingdom in a kind of earthly spatial way, but also middle between heaven and sort of the rest of reality. And so Japan, Korea, these other countries, these are way down the pecking order from China. So it's really upsetting to have the Japanese emperor claim to be on a level with the Chinese emperor. That's bad, bad, bad. And the other one is by sort of calling yourself the emperor of the land where the sun rises. That implication is that, we are as a country on the rise. We are young, we are going somewhere, and you are the land where the sun sets. You kind of had your day. It's possible to read too many implications, into that. But the emperor was certainly upset. The story we have is that he said basically, do not bring this letter to my attention again. I plan to forget about this episode. I don't want to hear about it again. So I think it's a really interesting moment. Clearly upset the Chinese, but it's this spirit in Japan from then and at regular intervals since. I don't know if it's how Canada feels about the United States, but you've got an enormous country on your border and you want to find ways of emphasizing your difference, emphasizing your independence. And Japan for centuries has been trying to do that, always with the sense that China is the political and cultural big brother.
It's interesting too, is how much does geography play into this? As you kind of look at it on the map, like you said, is to the east of China. Now, the Japanese archipelago is big enough to sustain a country's population, right? Large enough, but also distance enough that you're not going to be constantly invaded. Plus, China is dealing with all these competitors, north, west, south of them. They're busy kind of in that aspect. So they get the benefit of not being constantly invaded or constant turnover, which happens a lot in Chinese culture of when the dynasties got knocked over. You're separated enough to kind of refine, but also enough to kind of keep yourself distanced and that you don't have to pay the price of saying, hey, we're a distinct country. Leave us alone kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. Yeah, there's a book, Prisoners of Geography, I think, isn't it, there, which tells a lot of sort of world history by these almost accidents of geography. I think that's absolutely true for Japan. It's close enough to get the influence, get the benefits. I think it also benefits probably from the fact that neither China nor Korea, for most of history, have been especially aggressive, expansionary powers, at least not out in Japan's direction. Of course, there was a Chinese empire. But the Chinese, especially, I'm thinking about the early modern era now. If we were talking about the tale of Genji, say 1000 CE roughly, right? If we fast forward 500 or 600 years, maybe to the late 16th century, China is a bit suspicious of sending merchants abroad, creating a large navy. It sends occasional seaborne missions. The famous Ming voyages, they're called, went out a little while before. But in general, they see the sea as their natural border and as a place that you wouldn't necessarily want to cross. Whereas Japan, by the time you get to the 1590s, Japan is quite powerful. This is the age of the samurai. There's been a civil war in Japan, but they have brought the country more or less back together. And it's a Japanese warlord called Hideyoshi who goes the other way. So he sends tens and tens of thousands of samurai across to Korea, sends them up the Korean peninsula, has this grand, mad-sounding plan to invade China. So actually, Japan's proximity to the mainland Asia has probably more often than not been a problem for mainland Asia, than it has been for Japan, I think. And it's funny, this is what China says now. Obviously, Japan now in the 21st century is concerned about the rise of China. It's a very wealthy and powerful place. The Chinese would always say, as in the past, we don't have huge global imperial ambitions. Just look at how we've been in the past. That's how we are now. We've got our borders. We're planning to stick to them. It has across time more often been the Japanese who have that desire to throw their weight around a bit in Asia, to put it nicely.
You brought up the Hideyoshi and the feudal Japan. How about we kind of explore that a little bit? Next is, as Japan started becoming distinct, what was the shape of society in feudal Japan? We often hear terms like samurai and shogun, samurai, daimyo. What did these titles mean, and how was the structure of Japanese society in that age?
I suppose a useful way into it is to think, back around 1000 CE, The Tale of Genji, that novel that we were talking about. In that time, Japan was run from Kyoto by an emperor with a court around him, and they would have governors out in provinces around Japan. So that's when the imperial family had real power. Then, late 12th century, Japan ends up in a civil war between two really powerful warrior families. And we later come to talk about these people as samurai, from a verb, saburao, which means to serve. Because these were originally warriors who would serve aristocrats in Kyoto, or they would look after their land, right, out in the provinces. So originally service was what they did, military service. But then they became so powerful, two in particular, the Minamoto and the Taira, these two great warrior families, fought each other, and the winners, the Minamoto, took over real power. So at a place called Kamakura, not all that far from Tokyo, they set up a kind of military government. And so really from that time onwards, you've got samurai on the one hand, and then you've got the imperial court on the other. And really from that time onwards, from the late 12th century, really to now, the imperial family didn't really have much power. So the power would really be in the hands of the samurai, and in particular in the hands of the shogun. And that word is a short form of a Japanese word that means barbarian crushing generalissimo. So the idea was that the shogun sort of works for the emperor. He's going to look after security. He's the kind of head of security for the emperor. In reality, he aspires to control everything, right? Not just security, but political decisions, foreign relations, kind of everything. So, for a few hundred years, Japan is ruled by shoguns, first in Kamakura, later in Kyoto. But then you get to this really interesting period. It's called the Sengoku Jidai, the sort of warring states era, we call it. So this is really from, I would say, the late 15th century all the way to the end of the 16th century, where there isn't really a center of power in Japan at all. So it's more like a patchwork quilt of domains, and inside each domain is a feudal lord who controls everything in his own domain. And these domains are fighting each other, scheming, intermarrying, with the aim of expanding their power, eventually marching on Kyoto, and trying to reunite Japan under their own control. And we talked about Hideyoshi, so just really briefly to put him in a bit of context for your viewers. In Japan, three of the favourite historical figures of all time, they're called the three unifiers. So these are three warlords, one after the other, who steadily build up their domains and unify Japan. Oda Nobunaga is the first. Hideyoshi, who sends these troops to Korea trying to get to China, it ends in disaster, is the second. And then the third one is called Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he's the one who succeeds finally in unifying Japan. And his family ruled Japan for 250 years after that. And some of your viewers may have watched the FX series Shogun. It screens on Disney in the UK. I don't know how you get it in the US, but that is set right at the end of the period that we're talking about now. So if people haven't seen it, it's a brilliant way of getting into this history. It's just beautifully done. But those three guys, the so-called three unifiers, everyone knows about them in Japan. School children will be able to tell you all about them. They're hugely popular. They're seen as real heroes of taking quite a chaotic place and knitting it back together. And then Japan goes through a period of 250 years, more or less, of complete peace. And if you think about what happens in Europe in the same time, tearing itself apart, Japan does really well for those years.
You list out a phrase that Japanese children have when they're getting educated. Nobunaga pounded the rice, Hideyoshi kneaded the dough, and Ieyasu ate the rice cake. How does that summarize what these individuals did?
It's a great question about personalities. I think they are quite distinct. So Oda Nobunaga, the first one, pounding the rice, I suppose what people are getting at there is that he started off with a really tiny domain in central Honshu. So at the beginning, when he was a teenager, he took power. A lot of the people around him called him the Great Fool. He kind of went around town looking really scruffy, eating while he was walking. People thought that was rude. When his father died, I don't know if this is true or not, no one knows if it's true, he was rumoured to have had the Buddhist priests who prayed for his father's recovery unsuccessfully, placed in a temple and surrounded and then shot to death. Whether or not that's true, it gives you a sense of how ruthless he was. He was a clever strategist, we shouldn't underestimate that, but he was prepared to settle most scores with violence. He had his kind of warlord enemies. He also had Buddhist enemies. In this period, Japan's Buddhists, some at least of its big Buddhist sects, had their own armies. And he would send his men against them up the mountains where these Buddhist temples were based. And if there were women and children nearby, they would die as well. He was known to spare nobody. So clever strategist, successful, built his domain up really well, but remembered as a very bloody figure, I think. So that would be Oda Nobunaga, the first one. Second one, Hideyoshi, who bakes the cake. I suppose his big achievement is to take what Nobunaga had and expand it. So Japan, a lot of your viewers will be familiar, is basically made up of 4 main islands. In the period that we're talking about, the northernmost island wasn't really thought of as being part of Japan. So Japan has 3 main islands, right, in this period. Hideyoshi brought all 3 islands under his control. So a huge achievement. He was basically the dictator of Japan in the early 1590s. And for reasons that I don't think we really well understand, he sort of torpedoed his own reputation by deciding to go over to the Korean Peninsula. A really tragic period in Japanese-Korean relations. A huge number of people died in Korea because of that conflict, completely unnecessary conflict. And he seems towards the end of his life to certainly have become quite paranoid, as a lot of great leaders do, thinking someone's out to get what they've built, and possibly beyond paranoia into a genuine kind of insanity, but we don't really know. But certainly he's remembered as being pretty brutal, extraordinarily ambitious. He was a guy who started out as a peasant in quite a hierarchical society. His first job was carrying Nobunaga's sandals, and then he rose to become dictator of the whole country. And then the third one, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who eats the cake. Eating the cake means becoming shogun and having his family control the country for 250 years. It's a serious prize. He's thought about as being much more a man of strategic patience. He wouldn't charge in and fight a battle unless he had to. He'd rather be thought a coward and take his time. build up his wealth, his weapons, his warriors, make his plans, and when the time was right, he would strike, which he did, and it worked out, beautifully for him. So he's remembered as being, some people call him, the nickname he has is the Old Badger, for being kind of clever and cunning. So I think they're three quite different personalities, but Tokugawa Ieyasu, that extraordinary achievement to have your own family run the country for a quarter of a millennium. It's just amazing, and that's his big legacy.
One of the other things that's really interesting about this time is this is where European connection is probably the closest before the full opening of Japan. How did the Japanese view Europeans at that time? And were they skeptical of these? I'm sure they were skeptical of these foreigners coming in here. But what was their relationship with the European traders that had reached the islands?
Yeah, so as you say, this is when Europe arrives on Japan's doorstep for the first time in the 1540s, we think. So at first, the Japanese called them Namban, which means southern barbarians. So in the kind of Chinese worldview which Japan inherits, people from far beyond your borders, in whichever direction, are considered to be barbarians. It's a little bit like, for viewers of yours who are into ancient Greek history, they thought the same way, in these concentric circles. So people in the Greek city-states, they speak our language, behave like us, have the same values. From a man's point of view, they treat their women and their families in the same way. The further you go, they become more barbaric, and in the end, they're wild animals. They're not even human anymore, right? Similar sort of thing, I think, in East Asia. So the first Europeans were considered to be barbaric. Southern barbarians because they approached Japan from the south, from Southeast Asia, because they were Portuguese. At this point, the Portuguese Empire it had got as far as India. It was spreading across into China as well. So they thought they're barbarians. Also, the Portuguese, they ate with their hands rather than chopsticks. Japanese thought that was disgusting. They couldn't read or write Japanese or with Chinese characters. Again, that's a sign of kind of barbarism. Interestingly, in East Asia, to be a trader was considered to be quite a low occupation, which isn't, I suppose, at all the case in the modern world, but it certainly was back then. But the idea that you would leave your own families behind and leave your own country behind and travel a long way just to trade was again considered to be weird and barbaric. And there were rumours that maybe the Portuguese had been kicked out of their countries, and that's why they'd come to Japan. So that these guys were the undesirables of their home cultures, and that's why they'd come there. It's funnily enough, actually, just a really quick aside. We used to have in the UK, I don't know if you do this in the States, the acronym FILTH. Failed it, or you probably wouldn't have it in the US, but in the UK we had it for people who couldn't get a good job in the UK or in London, and so they'd go out to the finance industry in Hong Kong or somewhere, and we'd call them FILTH. Failed in London, try Hong Kong. So the Japanese kind of regarded them a little bit like that. These must be the people who couldn't make it back home, and so they've come here. So for all those reasons, they were looked on, I think, a little bit condescendingly. But the Portuguese merchants were running a trade that went from Lisbon in Portugal around to India, around to China, and eventually Japan becomes the far eastern part of that route. And it was extraordinarily lucrative, especially because they would bring Chinese silk to Japan and they would bring Japanese silver out back to China and elsewhere. Because in this period, Japan and China weren't trading directly. So the Portuguese, in their manners, maybe slightly barbaric, but these people were seriously wealthy. People can look up these lovely screen paintings that Japanese artists used to do whenever a huge Portuguese ship called a carrack would arrive in some port in Japan, and the guy who's the boss, the captain major, would march under an umbrella with all his servants behind him. These were sort of, I suppose the equivalent now would be a tech bro or something. These were incredible individuals, incredibly wealthy, and they brought lots of money into Japan. So I suppose in terms of manners, Europeans being looked down on, but in terms of the wealth that they brought into Japan was quite highly respected. The two other things they brought that I think are quickly worth mentioning, one was firearms. So Japan didn't have firearms before the Portuguese arrived, but the Portuguese brought them, the Japanese quickly adapted them, and so people like Oda Nobunaga, this warlord we talked about, very quickly he was mass producing these and giving them to his armies. And some people think that the three unifiers managed to unify Japan quicker because they had European weapons to sort of speed up the process. The other thing the Europeans brought was Christianity, which we talked about, a little earlier on. Some people became converts, very devout. We think about maybe 300,000 people converted, which is a lot because Japan's population was quite small in this period. But at the same time, it was always seen as being quite foreign, and the Japanese didn't really trust it. And so by the 1630s, so about 90 years after the Europeans first get there, Japan sort of pulls down the shutters. Most Europeans are kicked out. Christians are kicked out. Christianity's banned. I think the Japanese decide that so-called southern barbarians, they've been more trouble than they're worth. And so Japan pretty much closes the door.
They seem to be making very pragmatic decisions here. As traditional as the society is, they're like, hey, we'll take a little bit of that and we'll just kind of adapt it and use it, to get this leverage. And then once it's past its useful life, is discard it. We're moving on to the next thing. And they shut the door. How long did they shut the door for? And when did the door open back on for Westerners to get access Japan again?
They finally shut it at the end of the 1630s, and a very brutal crackdown against Christianity at the same time. I think their core worry, they kept hearing rumours that whenever a country like Spain or Portugal sent Christian or Catholic missionaries, as they were at that point, Catholic missionaries to somewhere like the Philippines, for example, first would go Christianity, then would come colonialism. So we used to say, first goes the Bible, then comes the sword. And in the Philippines, there was a certain amount of truth to that. So they thought this combination of Christianity and potentially being colonized by Europeans is completely unacceptable. So that's the main reason why they shut the door. They still traded with the Dutch, because they were Protestants and they weren't trying to evangelize. They thought they were kind of safe. But even the Dutch weren't allowed to enter Japan. They just had this tiny little artificial island in Nagasaki Bay, which if people go there, you can still see it now. And they traded a bit with China and Korea. But as far as the rest of Europe was concerned, the door was closed and no Japanese were allowed to leave Japan. If they did and they came back, they'd face execution. And the door was closed for a really long time. Didn't properly open until the 1850s. And this is where the US comes into the picture. So once the US has expanded and it's reached the Pacific coast, Japan then, once steam technology comes along, Japan is about 18 days by steamship from California. And so there's a sense that, Japan is in a sense the America's backyard. And it should be opened up at first just to American whaling ships who might need to use a port in Japan in an emergency or maybe to get some supplies. So the Americans want at least that kind of relationship with Japan. So they send someone who is certainly in Japanese history, a really famous figure, Commodore Matthew C. Perry, in 1853 arrives in Japan. What we call gunboat diplomacy, really. So he's got heavily armed steamships saying to the Japanese, we know how you've done things in the past. The world has moved on. We all trade with each other now. We all have relationships, and that's what we want. And if you don't let us have it, this is sort of Perry's ultimatum. I'll be back in a few months for your decision. And if it's a no, then there's going to be a conflict. And he's even said to have given the Japanese a kind of piece of white cloth. And he says, look, you have that. When I come back, if you say no, there'll be a fight. We will very quickly win it, and you can waive that when you're ready to surrender. So
very subtle, right?
Yeah, very subtle. So it's a kind of weird bid for peace that's actually, got these very violent undertones. But that is really, I think, the big moment. Because after that, of course, once the US get a diplomatic arrangement with Japan, the British want one, the French, the Russians, and everybody else. So bit by bit, across the 1850s and 1860s, Japan is throwing open the doors again.
Now that opens up what is called the Meiji Restoration. And what occurred in Japan at this time? Because it went from almost a feudalistic society to an industrial power, basically overnight in the terms of a country. How did the Meiji Restoration bring Japan up to the level of some of those European powers and start creating influence for them over the greater Asia sphere?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it goes back actually to what you said a little while earlier, which is this kind of pragmatism in Japan. So 1850s and 1860s, as I say, they're throwing open the doors to the West, but there's also a kind of blame game going on, because once you see the technology that the US has, that the British and the French have, steam power, weapons technology, once some Japanese go to North America, Europe, and elsewhere, they see what cities are like there. They see what medicine is doing, science is doing. They get back home and they say, look, we are an old and civilized place. Why have we not got all this? And so they look around and say, look, who's to blame here? And one of the things they blame, of course, is their set of political arrangements. They say the shogun, literally, as you were saying earlier on, the job description is barbarian crushing generalissimo. Not only has the shogun failed to do that, because Perry didn't get crushed, the Japanese just said yes to everything Americans and Europeans wanted, but also it was clear that under the shogunate, Japan had been held back. And so you get, in the 1860s, a civil war in Japan. The shogunate is thrown out, and you get this really interesting group of young samurai who become something a little bit like America's founding fathers. I wouldn't draw the comparison, too precisely, but nevertheless, a group of people who, for about a generation, are in charge of Japan, and they borrow and adapt every technology, every idea that Japan might need, and they lead it from the center. Edo becomes Tokyo. They decide which industries Japan's going to focus on. They get tax paid in cash. They change laws. They take on the American banking system. Just within a single generation, they scoop up everything that could be useful for Japan from around the world. And I suppose the big moment when they know they've arrived as a country, in 1904 to 5, Japan goes to war with Russia, this great semi-industrial power, and the Japanese beat the Russians. This huge moment when it's clear that for the first time in many centuries, an Asian power has vanquished a European or a Western one. And it's this moment for everybody in Japan, in the newspapers, they're out on the streets saying, we've arrived, we're at the top table now of global powers.
I was reading a book on Theodore Roosevelt here, and he brokered the peace treaty between Russia and Japan at that point too. It was very interesting to hear his take on the Japanese. He admired the Japanese. This people is incredible, but he also had a kind of a double-handed thing. He goes, we're going to need to watch out for them, and we're going to need to start putting some guard. So he was very famous for developing the Navy for the United States as well, because he was kind of seeing where things were going. He's like, these people are ambitious. They're going to be a problem here soon. And, Japan came in and knocked Russia around pretty effectively. And then all of a sudden, we've got a big player here on the Asia, over in Asia, that we now have to deal with. So it is kind of amazing that Japan speed ran that industrialization. And within, a generation, they were right on par with everybody else.
Yeah, they absolutely were. And a couple of things sort of come to mind quickly there. One is, of course, you can get to Japan from California in 18 days in the 1850s, right, by steamship. That obviously cuts the other way. You can get from Japan to the US should you want to very quickly. So, of course, Roosevelt, absolutely right to be worried. I suppose the other thing we think about as historians now is, although in the 1850s there was that blame game, I was telling you about, why have we not got all this stuff? Japan actually had got more or less everything it needed, at least to make the leap. The Meiji leap. This is a highly literate society. It speaks just one language. It was politically united. It had amazing infrastructure connecting all its big cities. It was reasonably wealthy. People were highly educated, and people were used to being controlled from a center and doing what they were told. So many of those ingredients you already had in Japan. And so I think some historians, particularly if they're historians of the Tokugawa period, would say, okay, yeah, the Meiji's great. That's a really exciting generation. But let's not forget all the stuff that happened under the Tokugawa that made that possible. So I think it's good to see both sides if we can. But certainly, by 1905, by the time that Theodore Roosevelt's worrying about this kind of thing, Japan was already a colonial power of sorts. It had gone up to the north, what we call Hokkaido, part of Japan. It had taken that. It had gone down to the south, Okinawa. It had taken that. It was already looking, within a few years, right, after the Russo-Japanese War, it's colonized Korea. So if you are a great statesman like Roosevelt, looking at the kind of trajectory, I'd be beefing up my navy too. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, at that point, Japan and the United States were on a collision course. And jumping ahead a little bit, I think we all are pretty well versed in World War II history to kind of see how the outcome came. Super industrialized Japan loses the war to the United States, and then is occupied by the United States. Now, the Allies had bombed the hell out of Japan during the war. How did Japan recover? It recovered quickly and as quickly as you can from that kind of devastation. What was the country looking like in that late 1940s, 1950s timeframe, and how did they started kind of getting back up on their feet?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think about in one of my books, I've called it Meiji 2.0, this occupation period. So, as you say, the US, it's an allied occupation, but it's mainly run by the US from 1945 to 52. I think some people in Japan would credit the US with part of Japan's swift emergence. So, this is not an occupation which punishes Japan, although it could have done, it doesn't. It's an occupation that tries to remake Japan, first of all, in America's New Deal image as a kind of sort of left liberal place where people's rights, including workers' rights, women's rights, are thought about quite carefully. You know, you get a lot of quite young Americans, men and women, working in the occupation who are pretty starry-eyed about what can be done in Japan in terms of remaking it. You know, there's a partly it's wartime propaganda, partly it's fair, and an image in America that Japan has been a fairly feudal society, even in up to the 1940s, meaning that there isn't a strong sense of individualism. And some Japanese intellectuals were saying the same thing. So a lot of the Americans who go out in the occupation period, they're saying, let's remake Japan as a real democracy, you know, in America's image. So Japan gets a lot of democratic reforms. Women get the vote. The power of the emperor is taken away. He becomes just a symbol. There are free and fair elections that are held. In many ways, it's a huge success, I think. The other thing the US does is it gives Japan quite generous peace terms when peace is made. So, as people know, the new Japanese constitution says in the late 40s, Japan cannot have a standing army. It cannot wage war. It forever, you know, renounces the right to make war. That's obviously very controversial now in Japan, amongst some people anyway. But the upside of that is all the money and expertise and industrial capacity that Japan might have had to put into rearming instead goes into making cars, making trains, making the Shinkansen. You know, the guys who come up with the Shinkansen all worked in the Imperial Japanese Navy, most of them, during the war. So they're taking those sorts of skills. So partly through America's help, Japan's industrial base grows again pretty rapidly. Maybe the other important part of it, which caused a lot of trouble in Japan later, was people had a sense of course, of having lost the war, but being given a chance to win the peace. And so you get a lot of young men, especially growing up, working these insane hours in these office jobs or factories or whatever else it is, putting work before everything, including before family, to build up Japan's, you know, white collar sector, its industry, very, very, very quickly. And of course, then Japan, again, with that pragmatism that you mentioned, it chooses the right sectors to focus on to build its economy. And I suppose the obvious example is cars. By choosing the right technology at the right time, maybe in the way that China's jumping on EV technology now potentially, or solar panels, etc. Those things together, I think, boost Japan so that by the early 1960s anyway, it's returned to its old form, a peaceful version of its old form. A place like Tokyo suddenly feels like a really affluent city, kind of the way it does now.
It's like all that energy that went into country building went into capitalism, and all of a sudden Japan just became capitalistic rock stars here in the good and the bad ways that can come about. I mean, I'm a 90s kid, which means I'm a 34-year-old man now. But growing up, it was always like Nintendo and Dragon Ball Z and anime and Toyota cars and everything. They started to export all of these culturally significant art pieces, technology, and everything back to the United States. And in some ways, that created some animosity here that Japan's kicking our butt economically. But there became this cultural pairing, which I think my generation probably sees more than the ones previously, is that, we played Pokemon, we played on our Nintendos and we were Switch, and it seems to be the coming together of two cultures and maybe something that's kind of like a generational sinew that kind of holds everybody together here in the modern era. Would you say that's a fair take of like that those exports over the next 5 decades or so really kind of created the Japan culture that we see today?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And on the resentment, just quickly, there's a video on YouTube that people can, I think it's still up, can go and see, of a crowd in Detroit in the 1980s with the Japanese, Detroit being famous center of auto manufacturing, with the Japanese car there, and you can pay $1 to hit the Japanese car with a baseball bat because people are so upset, about the kind of who won the war anyway sort of thing. I mean, we had the same thing in the UK. I'm just about old enough to remember if you were to buy a Sony television, someone might say, oh, isn't there a British company that makes televisions, And we feel the same way, not anymore, but back then about Germany, when its own, tech sector was doing really, really well. So yeah, I think that was an important kind of inflection point. The 80s into the 90s, the 80s is sort of the end of Japan as this rapidly rising up and coming manufacturing and tech power. Obviously, it's still really good at all that, but that period of rapid rise was kind of coming to an end. Yeah, and then the 90s, I remember it well myself. Yeah, you've got, of course, you've got Nintendo, Pokemon. Also, I think in the mid 1990s, you started to be able to get things like Studio Ghibli easily. The distribution was sorted out, so people were able to enter that world as well. And one of the things people say about why that was popular, which I quite like, I don't think it's the only reason, but I find it quite convincing, is so after the war in Japan, a young generation of manga artists, and they became anime artists, when the technology came along, never wanted to go back to having the kind of government Japan had, a kind of almost a military dictatorship. And one of the reasons why they thought they might be able to avoid that would be if they educated the younger generation about what human beings are really like. There's evil out there. Evil is real. You need to know it. You need to know that people will not always have your best interests at heart. And so they said, we're going to create a form of children's entertainment which doesn't patronize children, which shows you the whole of the adult world, makes it a reality for you. And that went into some of the great exports, like Astro Boy, for example, and many of the later ones. So whereas you might get British or American cartoons, if they're made for children, they would feel quite childish. But some of the Japanese ones, visually, yeah, they're for children, and they're not especially explicit, but nevertheless, the depth and the breadth of the world that they show people with that kind of subtlety is just extraordinary and feels different, and is quite, I think, was quite intriguing to viewers in the West, and I think it helped Japanese visual culture to take off. The sense that it had real depth. It's sometimes a bit easy to miss that point now, because quite certainly what we get here, and I've got young children who are really into Japanese culture. Quite a lot of it is kawaii culture, right? Cute culture, which is is fine, fair enough, but actually the bigger picture of Japanese visual culture is much deeper, much more philosophical, much more about giving children a real taste of the adult world. And I think that's part of why it's done so well since the 1990s to now, and it's still going strong.
I think that really kind of brings the conversation full circle because it is that blend of modernity and economic viability plus this tradition and historical looking back of where the Japanese people come in. And I guess we're kind of coming up on time here, so I don't want to keep it too long. But traveling to Japan has become a huge thing. You see it all over social media. If somebody is to plan a trip to Japan and they go and they see all the fun stuff, the Nintendos, the Pokemon, the cities, the Shibuya, how can they look at this in a more holistic glance of what the Japanese culture is, not just these exports or economic assets?
I think one thing is happening more and more with people traveling to Japan. I'd certainly recommend it, which is, if possible, fly into a regional airport. Even if you fly into Tokyo or Osaka, you can jump straight on another plane. Maybe go up north to somewhere like Aomori and come down on local trains, or if you can get a license, come down in a car. See a little bit more of rural Japan, away from the tourist trail. Get a flavour of it that way. Japan is still, I think, quite a regional country, in terms of cuisine, delicacies, local history, etc. Try and soak some of that up if you can, and then place it beside some of the more touristy stuff that you're going to see while you're there. I think if you can do a mixture of those, then that's great. You get a broader sense of what Japan is all about. I think because it has become so touristy, otherwise places like Kyoto and Tokyo, Japan is becoming better and better at packaging that for foreign audiences. I don't mean to say it's all fake, but it can feel like a very managed and packaged experience. Whereas tourism concentrates so much in those areas that you don't have to go far outside, and you might be the first foreigner people have seen, in some parts of Japan. And it's lovely. People speak often really good English. You'll fall into conversations. You'll just pick up a sense of Japan, which is really different from what you'll get on the tourist trail. And if you do both, you'll be able to make connections yourself. What makes people in Japan tick? What do they worry about? What are they proud about from their history? You can make all those sorts of connections. So I think that would be my travel tip. If people are able to do that, I think it'd be really rewarding, to see Japan that way.
It's an incredible place. I highly suggest. It's the one non-Western country I've been to, and I think it was a great eye-opening experience. So, Chris, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And thanks for all your work. Please share with the audience, where can they find you? What do you have out there, and how they can learn about the things you're putting together?
So I have a newsletter, Substack newsletter called Japan and the World, which goes out every Friday. Also, I'm on Instagram, Chris Harding Japan. I've just started a few months back. So either of those places you can find me, and you can link through from there if you want to my books as well.
Chris, appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.